They shaped an entire era of music. Their debut album hit number 8 in the UK in 1970. Paranoid went to number 1 that same year. They invented heavy metal, the crushing riffs, the doom-laden atmosphere, the darkness no one else dared to explore. Black Sabbath became the standard against which every metal band was measured. Then everything turned inward. Cocaine deliveries became part of the recording process. Members couldn't finish takes. Ozzy Osbourne spiraled into alcoholism and instability until the band fired him in April 1979. They replaced singers, fractured, reunited, fractured again. What followed damaged them permanently. Decades later, when they finally came back together for their farewell tour in 2017, original drummer Bill Ward refused to participate. The wounds were still too deep. The darkness they'd sung about for years had consumed them from the inside out. This is a story about how the heaviness that made them famous became the weight that crushed them. A band built on doom that couldn't survive the pressure of living inside it. But to understand how everything collapsed, we have to go back to the beginning. Birmingham, England, 1968. Industrial, working class, grey. The city was scarred by decades of factory work and post-war decline. Smoke from metalworks hung in the air. The atmosphere wasn't aspirational, it was suffocating. Rock wasn't a dream here. It was survival, an escape route from the monotony of assembly lines and dead-end jobs. 4 kids from that environment came together. Tony Iommi, the visionary, a guitarist who'd lost the tips of 2 fingers in a factory accident on his last day of work before pursuing music full-time. He had to retune his entire approach to playing, detuning his guitar and using lighter strings to accommodate his injury. That accident shaped everything that followed. The darker, heavier sound that defined Black Sabbath was born from physical limitation turned into innovation. Geezer Butler was the engine, a bassist and lyricist whose Catholic upbringing and fascination with the occult gave the band its thematic foundation. He wrote lyrics about war, death, and demons while delivering bass lines that rumbled like distant thunder. Ozzy Osbourne was the voice. A kid named John Osbourne who couldn't hold a job, couldn't fit into normal society, had no technical training, but possessed a raw, vulnerable wail that cut through everything. His voice didn't sound powerful. It sounded human, frightened, desperate. And that made it unforgettable. Bill Ward was the craftsman. A drummer who could shift from thunderous power to delicate jazz textures without losing the groove. He was the anchor, the one who kept the chaos rhythmically coherent. They started as polka talk blues band, playing heavy blues rock in local clubs. The name was forgettable. They became Earth, which felt more serious, more grounded. But another band already used that name, and they needed something distinct, something that would cut through the noise. One day, Geezer Butler noticed something. People would pay money to watch horror movies, to be frightened, to feel dread, to confront darkness in a controlled setting. They saw a poster for the 1963 Boris Karloff film Black Sabbath. The idea clicked immediately. What if music could do the same thing? What if a band leaned into fear, darkness, the occult? What if instead of offering escape, they offered confrontation? They took the name. They leaned into the scary. And everything changed. What made them different wasn't just the heaviness, it was the mood. Other bands in 1968 were singing about love, peace, psychedelic transcendence, flower power. Black Sabbath sang about war, death, depression, demons, and the void. Iommi's riffs were down-tuned and crushing. Butler's bass lines felt seismic. Ozzy's voice sounded haunted, like someone singing from inside a nightmare. Ward's drumming felt like the march towards something inevitable and terrible. Their lyrics became known for occult imagery and darkness-leaning themes. Critics and radio programmers often reviled their coarse, heavy approach. They were called crude, unsophisticated, dangerous. Radio wouldn't touch them, but fans showed up anyway. Their first real break came through constant touring. They played anywhere that would have them: clubs, theaters, festivals. They packed venues not because of radio play or critical acclaim, but because the music resonated with people who felt alienated, angry, misunderstood. Black Sabbath didn't sound like escapism, they sounded like truth. On October 16, 1969, they recorded their debut album at Regent Sounds in London. The entire album was tracked in a single day. Producer Roger Bain captured their live energy, raw, heavy, unpolished. The album Black Sabbath was released February 13, 1970, on Vertigo in the UK and Warner Brothers in the US. Despite critical negativity, it became a commercial success. It hit number 8 on the UK Albums Chart and number 23 on the Billboard 200. The heaviness that critics dismissed as amateurish was exactly what audiences wanted. But even then, the hidden weakness was already there. The darkness wasn't just a theme. It was real. Butler was genuinely obsessed with the occult, reading about black magic and demonology. Ozzy was already drinking heavily, using substances to cope with anxiety and the pressure of performing. The band's identity was built on exploring the void, and they had no plan for what happened if the void started staring back. It didn't seem dangerous at the time, but it never went away. 6 months after their debut, Black Sabbath released Paranoid on September 18, 1970. The album went to number 1 in the UK. It contained War Pigs, a blistering anti-war anthem. It contained Iron Man, with one of the most iconic riffs in rock history. And it contained the title track, Paranoid, which became their only UK top 20 hit, reaching number 4 on the singles chart. These songs became metal classics, the foundational hymns of a new genre. Paranoid didn't just succeed, it defined what heavy metal could be. The album was a commercial juggernaut despite continued radio resistance. The wins kept stacking. Their third album, Master of Reality, dropped August 6, 1971. It was recorded at Island Studios in London from February to April 1971. For that record, Iommi and Butler down-tuned their instruments even further to create what they described as a bigger, heavier sound. The guitar was tuned down multiple steps, making the riffs feel apocalyptic. Master of Reality peaked at number 5 in the UK and number 8 in the US. It was eventually certified double platinum by the RIAA. Public reaction was massive. Industry pressure increased. Black Sabbath were no longer an underground phenomenon. They were stars. By 1972, they'd sold millions of records. They were the band critics loved to hate and fans couldn't get enough of. The heaviness, the occult imagery, the doom-laden lyrics, it all worked. Despite the lack of mainstream radio support, constant touring had turned them into one of the biggest bands in the world. But something changed behind the scenes. They went to Los Angeles to record their fourth album at Record Plant in May and June 1972. This was the first Black Sabbath album not produced by Roger Bain, who'd been with them since the beginning. Production was credited to the band and their manager Patrick Meehan, but Tony Iommi did much of the practical production work. The album was originally going to be titled Snowblind, a direct reference to cocaine use and the album's song, Snowblind, which became their most explicit drug reference. The working title wasn't subtle. It was honest. What fans didn't see was building quietly. Cocaine had become part of the creative process. Album notes document cocaine deliveries arriving during recording sessions. The band later thanked Coca-Cola in the liner notes as a notorious in-joke. Everyone who knew. The label changed the title to Volume 4 rather than release an album with an obvious drug reference on the cover. They wanted the music without the controversy. But the substances were already embedded in the sound, in the process, in the band's daily reality. Volume 4 was released September 25, 1972. The album cover used a photo of Ozzy with his hands raised, taken from a January 1972 show at Birmingham Town Hall. It was successful commercially, but the recording process had been chaotic, unstable, dangerous. Bill Ward later described struggling to record cornucopia after heavy drug use, barely able to keep time. The darkness they sang about was no longer metaphorical or theatrical. It was in the studio with them, affecting their ability to function. The album included Changes, a piano ballad that showcased Ozzy's vulnerable side, proving they could shift from crushing heaviness to delicate emotion. But the contrast only highlighted how fractured they were becoming. One moment they were exploring beauty and vulnerability. The next, they were buried in substances they couldn't control. This success came with expectations they couldn't escape, and the lifestyle was starting to break them down. By the mid-1970s, Black Sabbath were massive. They'd become the standard against which all heavy metal was measured. Their influence was undeniable. Every doom-heavy band, every group exploring darkness and heaviness, was compared to Black Sabbath first. They were the blueprint. The apex moment wasn't one show. It was the realization that they'd created an entire genre. They'd taken the darkness, the occult imagery, the crushing riffs, and turned it into a movement. Stadiums filled. Albums sold. The mythology around them grew. Their reputation was built on what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame would later call hymns of doom. Dark, demonic, heavy beyond anything that had come before. From the outside, this looked like the perfect moment. They were legendary. Untouchable. Inside the band, this was where things stopped working. The problem was that Black Sabbath's identity was built on exploring darkness, dysfunction, and doom. And once you build your entire career around that, once your lyrics are about paranoia, war, death, and demons, it becomes impossible to separate the art from the reality. The themes weren't just creative choices anymore. They were becoming autobiographical. Ozzy wasn't just singing about paranoia and alienation, he was living it. The substance abuse that fueled the creativity during Volume 4 didn't stop. It escalated. The alcohol consumption increased. The cocaine use continued. The pressure to stay heavy, stay dark, stay relevant crushed them. Touring became relentless. They were on the road constantly, playing show after show, city after city, with no real breaks. The exhaustion compounded the substance abuse. The substance abuse made the touring harder. It was a cycle with no exit. They kept recording throughout the 1970s, producing album after album. But the cohesion was fracturing. Iommi tried to hold it together musically, writing riffs that kept the heaviness intact. Butler kept writing the apocalyptic lyrics, channeling his own darkness into the songs. Ward powered through, trying to maintain the rhythm section despite his own struggles. But Ozzy was spiraling, drinking more, using more, showing up less and less prepared. The peak had become a trap. The darkness that made them famous, that gave them their identity, their commercial success, their influence, was now consuming them. They'd opened a door they couldn't close. By 1978, the band was barely functional. Ozzy's alcoholism had reached a breaking point. He couldn't deliver in the studio with any consistency. He couldn't perform reliably on tour. Some nights he'd show up so drunk he could barely stand. Other nights he wouldn't show up at all. The other members tried to compensate, tried to cover for him, but it wasn't sustainable. The trust was eroding. The weight of keeping Black Sabbath together fell almost entirely on Tony Iommi. He wrote the riffs. He managed the studio sessions. He dealt with the label. He kept the band touring. But even Iommi couldn't carry Ozzy's instability forever. In April 1979, Black Sabbath fired Ozzy Osbourne. It wasn't a public implosion with press conferences and dramatic statements. It wasn't a violent walkout or a staged confrontation. It was quiet, inevitable, sad. The man whose voice had defined Black Sabbath, whose vulnerability and raw emotion had made songs like Paranoid and War Pigs and Changes unforgettable, was too broken to continue. Sources consistently attribute the split to escalating drug and alcohol problems and instability. Ozzy was unreliable. He was unpredictable. And the band couldn't function around him anymore. The lowest moment wasn't the firing itself. It was what came after, the realization that Black Sabbath without Ozzy wasn't really Black Sabbath anymore. Yes, Iommi wrote the riffs that defined the sound. Yes, Butler wrote the lyrics that gave the band its thematic depth. Yes, Ward kept the rhythmic foundation solid. But Ozzy was the voice fans connected to. He was the fragile human element in a band that sang about darkness and demons. His vulnerability made the heaviness feel real. Immediately, the consequences hit. The identity was compromised. Fans were confused, angry. Could Black Sabbath continue without Ozzy? Should they? The band made a decision. They would continue. They replaced Ozzy with Ronnie James Dio, a technically superior vocalist with a completely different style. Dio had fronted Rainbow and had a powerful, operatic voice. He brought precision, theatricality, control. But he didn't bring vulnerability. He didn't bring the wounded, human quality that made Ozzy's voice so devastating. Black Sabbath released Heaven and Hell with Dio on April 18, 1980. Produced by Martin Birch, the album peaked at number 9 in the UK and number 28 in the US. It was certified platinum. Critics called it a resurrection. Retrospectives framed the Dio era as a major comeback after Ozzy's firing. Musically, it was brilliant, powerful, heavy, ambitious. But the fracture was permanent. The band that had invented heavy metal had fundamentally changed. There was no clean way back to what they'd been. The darkness had claimed its first major casualty. After the split, the members went separate directions, and the contrast was stark. Ozzy Osbourne, the man who'd been fired for being too unstable to function, launched a solo career that eventually made him more famous than he'd ever been in Black Sabbath. His debut solo album Blizzard of Oz in 1980 was a massive success. Diary of a Madman followed in 1981. Both became classics. Ozzy overcame the addiction that nearly killed him, or at least learned to function despite it. He became a reality TV star with the Osbournes in the early 2000s and turned into a cultural icon. Ironically, the man Black Sabbath fired for being too unstable ended up outlasting them all in the public consciousness. Tony Iommi kept Black Sabbath going through multiple eras, multiple singers, multiple lineups. The band's discography is extensive, 19 studio albums and 37 singles across decades. Dio was replaced, then replaced again, and again. Iommi was the constant, the one who refused to let the name die, who kept writing riffs, who carried the identity forward. But every lineup change diluted the original spirit a little more. Geezer Butler and Bill Ward cycled in and out of the band, participating in some eras and skipping others. The instability became part of the brand. Black Sabbath was no longer a band in the traditional sense. It was a rotating concept held together by Iommi's riffs and the weight of the name. On July 13, 1985, the original lineup reunited briefly for Live Aid in Philadelphia. They played Children of the Grave, Iron Man, and Paranoid. For 17 minutes, it felt like closure, a reminder of what they'd been at their peak, when the four of them were young and hungry and creating something the world had never heard before. The performance was powerful. Fans were ecstatic. But when it ended, they went their separate ways again. The wounds were still too fresh. The resentments still too deep. But the story wasn't over. In 2006, Black Sabbath were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The official inductee page emphasized their lyrical focus on the dark and demonic as part of their identity and impact. The band's legacy as the architects of heavy metal was secure. They'd changed music forever. Their influence was undeniable. But the relationships weren't healed. The induction was ceremonial, not emotional. They stood on stage together, accepted the honor, and went home. The brotherhood was still broken. Then, in 2013, something unexpected happened. Ozzy, Iommi, and Butler reunited for a new studio album. After decades of distance, lawsuits, resentments, and silence, 3/4 of the original lineup came back together to make music. 13 was released in June 2013, produced by Rick Rubin. It hit number 1 on the UK Albums Chart, their first UK number 1 since Paranoid in 1970. That's a 43-year gap between number 1 albums. It was an official chart record. The album also hit number 1 on the US Billboard 200, the first time Black Sabbath had ever topped the American chart. First week US sales were 155,000 copies. It should have been a triumph. The original members, now in their 60s, proving they could still create crushing, doom-laden metal. Critics praised it. Fans bought it. The album was proof that the darkness, the heaviness, the power, it was all still there. But behind the scenes, the conflict was still festering. Geezer Butler later publicly questioned what Rick Rubin actually did on the album, implying the production credit was more symbolic than functional. Butler suggested Rubin's involvement was minimal, that the band had done most of the work themselves. It was a small comment, but it revealed the underlying tension. And Bill Ward, the original drummer, one of the 4 founders, the craftsman who'd powered every classic Black Sabbath album, refused to participate. He cited financial and contractual disputes with the rest of the band. Ward felt disrespected, undervalued. He couldn't agree to the terms. So he walked away. Tommy Clufidos filled in on drums. The album was successful without Ward, but his absence was a wound that never closed. Years later, the conflict wasn't about music anymore. It was about legacy. Who controlled the Black Sabbath name? Who deserved credit for creating the sound? Who had been wronged during the chaotic years? Who had sacrificed more? In 2017, Black Sabbath announced the End Tour, their final farewell. The tour was designed to be definitive, the last chance to see the legendary band. It culminated on February 4, 2017, at Hentain Arena in Birmingham, their hometown. Ozzy, Iommi, and Butler performed. Bill Ward was not there. The concert was filmed and released as Black Sabbath, The End of the End on September 28. The live album The End, Live in Birmingham was released November 17, 2017. The package also included The Angelic Sessions, described as the band's final studio recordings. But even in the farewell, the fracture was visible. Bill Ward's absence hung over the entire event like a ghost. Interviews from that era show Iommi, Butler, and Ward still couldn't agree on what went wrong or who was to blame. Decades had passed, and the wounds were still open. The band that had invented heavy metal, that had explored darkness, doom, and dysfunction for nearly 50 years, ended without full reconciliation. The darkness had consumed them. Today, Black Sabbath are frozen in history. Tony Iommi is retired from touring, focusing on his health after battles with lymphoma. Geezer Butler occasionally plays guest spots but has largely stepped back. Ozzy continues his solo farewell tours, though his health is failing. Parkinson's disease and other issues have slowed him down significantly. Bill Ward largely stays out of the public eye, still estranged from the others, still carrying the resentment of being excluded from the final chapter. The music remains. Paranoid, Master of Reality, Volume 4. These albums are still the blueprint for doom metal, stoner rock, sludge metal, and every heavy band that values atmosphere over speed. Generations of musicians cite Black Sabbath as the reason they picked up instruments, the reason they believed heavy music could be art. Their debut album, recorded in a single day at Regent Sounds, is still considered foundational to heavy metal's emergence. The crushing riffs, the occult themes, the darkness, it all started there. But the brotherhood never healed. The darkness they explored in their lyrics, the paranoia, the isolation, the weight of existence, the inevitability of doom, became the reality of their relationships. The substances that fueled the creativity during Volume 4 didn't stay confined to one album or one era. They became part of the lifestyle, part of the identity, part of the destruction. The instability that made Ozzy's voice so raw and vulnerable, that fragility that wounded humanity, also made him impossible to work with. The heaviness that made them famous became the weight that crushed their ability to function as a unit. What was lost wasn't just a band. It was the unity. The four kids from Birmingham who'd stumbled into inventing a genre, who'd named themselves after a horror movie and leaned into the darkness, couldn't survive the pressure of what they'd created. Success didn't destroy Black Sabbath. The darkness did. And unlike the horror movies they'd named themselves after, there was no final act where the heroes defeat the monster and walk away victorious. The monster won. Slowly. Inevitably. Black Sabbath proved you can sing about the void for decades, but if you stare into it long enough, it stares back. And it doesn't let go. They opened the door to darkness and walked through. And they never found a way to close it behind them. Which part of this story hit you the hardest? Did you ever see Black Sabbath live in any era? The Ozzy years, the Dio era, the reunion tours? Do you think the darkness was always going to consume them, or could they have survived if things had been different? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how you see their legacy. If you want more stories about bands that couldn't survive their own mythology, hit subscribe. We've got so many more coming. Thanks for watching and please subscribe my channel.